A few minutes after the explosion, a train departing for Hiroshima became a corridor of death. Inside the wagons, the air was dense and fetid, and the passengers, many of them burned and disfigured, could barely move. They were being transported toward the epicenter of the tragedy, carrying their own wounds as the train advanced through the devastation. Charles Pellegrino describes scenes of absolute silence, broken only by moans of pain and pleas for help. Faces covered in burns that made the skin look as if it were melting. Many were already in shock. Others were simply waiting for death, as the train carried them to the place where horror had reached its peak. The accounts in this video come from Charles Pellegrino's book, To Hell and Back, The Last Train from Hiroshima. If you have a strong stomach, prepare yourself to learn about what became known as the walking ants of Hiroshima. A boy of only 14 years old, named Akihiro, wandered through the ruined streets, not knowing whether he was alive or dreaming a nightmare. Despite having burns, he was in better condition than many others around him. Amid the smoke, he followed the tram tracks. Twisted wagons, covered with charred bodies, marked the path of destruction. It was then that he heard a familiar voice calling his name. It was a childhood friend. As he approached, Akihiro realized that behind him, a line of people was beginning to form. Or rather, what was left of them. The so-called walking ants followed him in silence, aimlessly, covered in burns, their eyes lost in the void. His friend was unrecognizable. The body was already succumbing to the effects of radiation. The teeth were falling out, one by one, and his belly darkened with purple blotches. He vomited continuously a thick, grayish substance, as if his own body were dissolving from the inside. During the desperate march for survival, Akihiro saw horrors that would mark his memory forever. A woman with one of her eyes hanging down the side of her face. A dead horse, completely without skin, its muscles exposed and shining with blood, trapped in a hydraulic structure. Even trying to move away from that apocalyptic scenery, it was as if hell followed him. Wherever he went, the ghostly figures accompanied him, more dead than alive, but still walking. At one moment, he ran through the debris and passed by a young mother fallen on the ground. Her body was completely skinned, but beside her, the baby was still crying, alive and charred. Akihiro kept moving forward, trying to escape, but even after surviving, he would say that some of the horrors he witnessed that day simply could not be put into words, and perhaps because of that, he could never forget them. One of the most shocking accounts tells of a man who, being very close to the point of the explosion, had his face almost completely melted by the intense heat of the bomb. The skin and muscles fused together like hot wax, leaving a black, amorphous mask. Despite the unimaginable pain, the man managed to crawl to an improvised shelter, where he spent days agonizing, the flesh falling off in pieces and the odor of burned flesh saturating the environment. Pellegrino describes the state of this victim as a vision of hell on earth, the human body transformed into walking ashes. Almost 2 kilometers from the epicenter of the explosion, a woman named Mrs. S. was quietly tending her garden when the sky shone in a supernatural way. In an instant, everything around her collapsed. Miraculously, she managed to get out of the rubble holding her 2-year-old daughter in her arms. Neither of them appeared to be injured. It was as if they had been spared for some unknown reason. Years later, Mrs. S. still wondered how that had been possible. She felt a mix of gratitude and relief that her daughter did not remember anything they had witnessed that day. She never had the courage to bring up the subject with her. Some images were simply impossible to explain, like the figure that staggered out of the destruction. It was right after the flash. The woman thought they were alone, surrounded only by smoke and silence. But then, a human figure emerged from the ruins. A thin man, covered in ashes, ran toward the smoke as if in a trance. He said nothing. He asked for no help. He ran as if nothing else existed around him. But the most disturbing thing was the sound he made with each step. A rhythmic, metallic click, as if he were tap dancing with iron shoes. It was only when he passed closer that Mrs. S. realized the horrible truth. That sound did not come from any shoes. The man no longer had feet, only 2 stumps of white bones, breaking and shattering with every step on the hot asphalt. That was what produced that cruel and mechanical sound, the bones hitting the ground, like living fragments being crushed. And even so, he kept running until he completely disappeared into the smoke, taking with him the sound of tap dancing straight from hell. An interesting fact is that about 70% of Hiroshima's buildings were destroyed or severely damaged by the explosion and the fires that followed. After the explosion, thousands of people were buried under the rubble of collapsed houses and buildings. Many were still alive, moaning for help, but trapped and unable to move. Rescues were slow and painful, and many victims died before they could be pulled out. Pellegrino tells stories of rescuers who heard muffled cries from beneath stones and wood, trying to reach the victims before lack of air, and injuries brought death. The physical and psychological suffering of those moments was indescribable, with many people dying in solitude and darkness. A touching account is that of a child who, in an attempt to escape the flames, jumped into the Otagawa River. Despite the burns and the fear, the child managed to swim to the shore, where survivors found and cared for them. Pellegrino highlights the miracle of survival amidst the devastation, showing how even in the face of chaos, hope can persist. Just before the explosion that would change everything, a foreign missionary, known only as Father M., heard the sound of 2 planes cutting across the skies of Hiroshima. The engines roared loudly, as if fleeing from something. He does not remember the flash, only waking up in the middle of an apocalyptic scene, surrounded by a crowd of nearly naked people covered in wounds, walking in silence as if in a trance. Later, these victims would be called human ants. In front of him, a man walked with skin hanging from his back like strips of soaked cloth. His arms were so burned that the bones were already visible. It was like following a dead man who still insisted on walking. The priest kept moving until he stumbled upon the charred skeleton of a streetcar. Inside, the carbonized bodies of an entire family remained motionless. But something horrifying made him shudder. The burned belly of a woman still seemed to move. A baby, not yet born, was giving its last signs of life. Shocked, he staggered back, his stomach turning. Unknowingly, he had led a line of survivors as disoriented as he was. More than a dozen followed him, as if searching for a guide amid the chaos. He had no idea where to go. He just walked. Suddenly, a scream from above caught his attention. He looked and saw a building, the only one still standing, with 3 stories, and on top of it, 3 completely naked children screamed desperately. One of them seemed bathed in blood, though still alive. They appeared to be trapped there, surrounded by smoke and heat. The priest turned his gaze away and walked toward the river. There, the first boats were beginning to collect bodies. Beside him, a woman begged for the child in her arms to open his eyes. She stepped into the shallow waters, but her body could no longer endure. The flesh began to peel from her bones. The priest, until then numbed by the horror around him, was overcome by a crushing guilt. And then, amid the nightmare, the image of the 3 children returned to his mind. He never knew their fate, but until the end of his life, they remained there, vivid, in the last memory before falling asleep. And every night, it was their screams that echoed in his dreams. Another interesting fact is that women and children made up the majority of the victims, since many men were away from the city because of the war. In some areas, about 60% of the victims were women. About 20 to 30 minutes after the explosion, a black rain began to fall. This rain, saturated with radioactive dust, soot, and debris, caused additional burns and worsened the suffering of the wounded. Pellegrino details that the water looked like thick oil, cold and sticky, bringing temporary relief, but carrying with it the silent death of radiation. Many survivors who initially escaped the bomb eventually succumbed to the contamination brought by the black rain. In the days following the attack, the horror did not end. The intense thirst was caused by burns, heat, and dehydration. Pellegrino narrates how desperate people wandered the streets in search of water, even if contaminated. Many died of thirst, unable to find a single clean sip. Hunger also became a scourge, since supply routes were destroyed and the city was isolated. The physical suffering was compounded by the psychological, as hunger and thirst drove people into even deeper despair. Suomi was a naval designer and was almost 3 kilometers from the epicenter when the sky lit up like 1,000 suns. Without thinking, he threw himself into an irrigation ditch and covered his head. A deafening blast followed soon after, shaking the ground and tossing his body into the air as if he were a rag doll. When he lifted his eyes, he saw burning papers and flaming pieces of clothing falling from the sky like cursed snow. A sharp pain ran through his left arm. The skin had burned so badly it resembled the dark, crispy crust of an over-roasted chicken. Desperate for water, he ran to the nearest river. The smell was nauseating, a mix of blood, smoke, and death. Even so, Suomi bent down and drank. That was when he noticed something strange. The bodies floating in the water had absurdly long arms, almost doubled in size. Only then did he realize the flesh had melted off the bones and slid down the arms, clinging only by the fingertips like deformed ribbons. On the riverbank, a group of children caught his attention. The boys were silent, motionless, their backs covered with something strange. From afar, it looked like fur. But as he approached, he understood what it was. Fragments of black glass, long shards deeply embedded in their flesh. The explosion had pierced them with shrapnel all over their bodies. He tried to help. He asked them to remove the shards from one another, but it was too late. The children's strength drained away with each passing minute. One by one, they began to collapse. Everywhere, people wandered as if hypnotized. They drank the dirty water from the river, sat on the banks, and then staggered to their feet again, aimlessly, disappearing into the thick smoke like living ghosts. Yamaguchi no longer thought about military duty, orders, or war. His only wish was simple: to go home, to see his wife, to hold his son. But the way back was a true corridor of horror. At one point, he saw a woman sitting on the ground, cradling the body of a dead child in her arms while humming a lullaby. Further ahead, a horse, or what was left of it, lay on the ground. Its head was on fire with a bluish-green flame that seemed to dance in the wind. To cross one of the rivers along the way, there was no bridge left, but the number of piled-up bodies was so great that it formed a kind of dam of charred flesh. He had no choice. He crawled over them, feeling every texture, every heat, every bone beneath his hands. The crossing would mark him forever. For the rest of his life, he would wake in the middle of the night, reliving that moment, sweating cold, trying to escape a river made of the dead. The reconstruction of Hiroshima took more than 10 years for the city to return to basic functioning, and decades for the complete recovery of its infrastructure. The soldiers and doctors sent to help the survivors faced unimaginable horrors. Pellegrino describes the shock of these professionals upon finding carbonized bodies, severe injuries, and the collapse of medical services. Without adequate resources, many doctors did what they could to ease the pain of the wounded, but were powerless against the magnitude of the destruction. The trauma of these first responders was profound, as they saw the brutality of war and of the bomb up close, with scenes that marked their lives forever. Shortly after the explosion, a desperate mother walked across the Misasa Bridge carrying her severely injured son. The bridge was partially destroyed, with loose planks and missing sections. The boy cried out for help. His skin burned in several areas, while the mother tried to find assistance amid the flames and thick smoke. They were exhausted, and the boy's weight seemed to sap the mother's strength with every step. When part of the bridge gave way, leaving them stranded above the murky waters, her anguish grew, but she continued to hold her son, silently begging for a miracle amid the devastation. A soldier named Nishioka was stationed outside Hiroshima when he felt the earth tremble beneath his feet. Then, he heard a muffled roar coming from the direction of the city. And then he saw it. A colossal cloud, in the shape of a mushroom, began to rise slowly into the sky, as if hell itself had opened its gates over Hiroshima. Minutes later, a train appeared on the horizon. It was coming from the city, but something was terribly wrong. All the cars had lost their windows. The glass was shattered, twisted, and inside what could be seen was almost unbelievable. Most of the passengers were burned to the bone. Many no longer even looked alive. But among the bodies, there were some faces. Motionless faces, frozen, staring outward with open, empty eyes, as if they were trapped between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The train did not stop. It passed slowly by the soldiers, who watched in absolute silence. 2 of the cars were still on fire. Others released thick smoke, as if the very vehicle were dying along with its occupants. The engineer, or what was left of him, was hanging from the locomotive window. His clothes were in tatters, his body covered in blood and soot. He leaned his head outside and vomited a thick, yellowish foam. He looked like a scarecrow possessed by something beyond human comprehension. The soldiers managed to stop the train. They took control of the locomotive and decided to continue the journey back to Hiroshima in search of answers, or at least survivors. Nishioka went with them. As they advanced, what they saw was like a vision of the final judgment. Along the tracks, an endless line of people walked, fleeing the city. The locomotive moved slowly, whistling constantly, trying to clear a path among the moving bodies. The closer they got to the center, the worse the injuries became. The people were charred, disfigured. Some carried others in their arms. Others walked alone, but with staggering steps, as if the body had already given up, but the soul still refused to fall. Many murmured the same word over and over. Water, water. It was all they could say. Nothing else mattered. They walked in silence, forming endless lines, one after another, all burned, all in a trance. They moved so mechanically, so automatically, that the few survivors who witnessed that scene began to call them walking ants, ant walkers. It was a procession of pain and despair, a silent march toward nothingness. And Nishioka, on that now empty train, just watched, mute, as the locomotive advanced slowly through the wreckage of a city that had ceased to exist. From 1945 to 1950, the population of Hiroshima dropped from about 350,000 to about 137,000 inhabitants due to immediate deaths, radiation, and migration. A man, visibly in critical condition, dragged himself through the streets with the skin of his leg almost completely burned, hanging in black strips and exposed like raw flesh. He limped, leaving a bloody and fetid trail, desperately seeking water to ease the unbearable pain caused by the burns. With each step, the man seemed to carry not only the weight of his body, but the burden of the agony that spread across his entire skin. The rescuers who found him were shocked by his endurance, but knew he needed immediate aid to survive. In the moments following the bombing, many survivors were paralyzed, not only physically but psychologically. Pellegrino describes scenes in which the streets were filled with people sitting or fallen, motionless, their eyes fixed on the void, as if they had given up the fight for life. The silence was absolute. No moan, no word, only an oppressive stillness that permeated the air, signaling the devastating impact of the trauma. Akiko and her friend Asami were starting another workday at a bank in Hiroshima when everything changed in an instant. The bomb fell exactly at 8:15 in the morning, and the impact was so close, only 250 meters from the epicenter, that survival seemed impossible. The building they were in was made of granite and reinforced concrete, which helped shield the 2 women from the initial flash and the most direct blast. But even so, when the shockwave hit, the air seemed to vanish from Akiko's lungs. She felt a sharp pain in her chest, as if she were being crushed from the inside. Asami, on the other hand, was thrown against the wall, her body folded like an accordion. Shards from the walls and ceiling began to fly, turning the inside of the bank into a field of sharp fragments. In the minutes that followed, Akiko drifted between lucidity and unconsciousness. trying to understand what had just happened. The pain in her lungs was unbearable, and the confusion absolute. Soon after came a maddening thirst. It wasn't an ordinary thirst. It was as if every drop of moisture had been sucked out from inside her body. That's because, with the extreme heat of the explosion, even the rivers of the city evaporated almost instantly, and the moisture from plants, animals, and even people was ripped away in the blink of an eye. They found a broken pipe, and with the helmets used for air raid protection, they tried to collect the little water that trickled out. But no matter how much they drank, the thirst never went away. Inside the bank, the heat became unbearable. 10 minutes after the explosion, at 8:25, they finally managed to exit through the doors, and what they saw resembled a scene from hell. The sky had turned completely dark, choked by smoke. The red of the flames reflected on the clouds, and everything around them was covered in an apocalyptic glow. Akiko looked out onto the street. At first, she thought there was no one, but soon she noticed the bodies. Many of them. Some were piled up, blackened, completely burned. There were corpses that looked as though they had disintegrated into brittle sheets. Others looked like melted wax dolls, unrecognizable. She saw a man still standing, like a carbonized statue. He was pulling a two-wheeled cart, and inside it were two small children, curled up, hugging their knees, dead, covered by a crust of charcoal. Akiko knelt on the ground in shock. Beside her, she saw something that froze her completely, a hand still intact, with fingers pointing upward, burning slowly like human candles. Fat dripped down the fingers, feeding the flames. Suddenly, the rain began to fall. The two women, desperate, lifted their faces to the sky and drank with their mouths open. But the water had a bitter, unpleasant taste. When Akiko looked at her own arm, she saw her skin was stained black. It was a thick, heavy rain, with the appearance of oil. They didn't know it, but that rain was impregnated with radioactive particles, carried up by the mushroom cloud into the stratosphere, and now falling back to the earth. Every drop was toxic, dangerous, lethal. Akiko survived, but Asami, unfortunately, did not. Days later, she succumbed to radiation sickness, a direct consequence of the exposure and the contaminated water. About 12,000 children lost their parents in the attack, becoming orphans. Rescuers found a man completely carbonized, standing upright with his arms outstretched. His skin had been burned to the point of becoming a black, brittle crust, leaving his body with the appearance of a macabre statue. Despite the severity of his state, he was alive, motionless, as if frozen in time, trapped between life and death. His empty expression reflected the indescribable horror caused by the explosion, becoming a silent symbol of the destruction wrought by the bomb. The bombing did not affect only human beings. Animals were also profoundly impacted. Charles Pellegrino describes how dogs and cats fled in panic, some crossing turbulent rivers and debris-filled streets, others simply disappearing, never to be seen again. Confusion and fear took over the animal life of the city, which, just like their human owners, faced chaos and abandonment. This frenzied flight of animals reflected the total rupture of normalcy, where even nature itself reacted to the disaster. A boy of only 13 years old, named Yoshikata, managed to survive the collapse of the school where he was. By luck, he was trapped in an air pocket among the rubble and, with effort, managed to emerge to the surface shortly after the explosion. When he looked up, he saw a gigantic mushroom-shaped cloud taking over the sky, a vision that seemed torn from a nightmare. Around him, among broken concrete blocks and destroyed walls, were classmates partially buried, injured, and in agony. Many burned hands emerged from the rubble, trying to reach Yoshikata, clinging to his legs and ankles in search of help. The scene was too terrifying for his young heart. Overcome with panic, he pulled free from the hands that held him and ran, desperate, disappearing into the thick smoke. A young soldier named Shigo Shimoyama was only a few blocks from the impact point when the bomb fell on Hiroshima. By a stroke of luck, he had just entered a warehouse built with reinforced concrete. The force of the blast hurled him violently against the back wall, which, ironically, saved his life. since the roof collapsed immediately afterward. Outside, most of his comrades had been instantly erased from existence. When Shigo regained consciousness, he realized something terrible. His body was pinned to the wall by nails that had come loose with the impact. They were embedded in his shoulders and arms, suspending him almost a meter from the ground. After managing to free himself, still dazed, he stepped outside. Amid the destruction, he spotted in the distance a group of men moving through the rubble. They were government officials carefully carrying a full-body portrait of the emperor, rescued from the ruins of an official building that now burned in flames. As he watched, he noticed a military boat moving slowly along the river, navigating among debris and bodies. The vessel stopped, and all the crew stood in position to salute the image of the emperor. This gesture seemed to echo among the survivors nearby. Even in critical condition, many wounded turned toward the portrait and bowed their heads in a sign of respect. Further ahead, Shigo came across a surreal scene. A completely disfigured horse, covered in raw, pink flesh, with no sign of hair or skin. It took him a while to understand what he was seeing. The animal had suffered a phenomenon known as degloving, in which the skin is ripped away by extreme pressure waves, as if removed all at once, leaving only the exposed tissues. Although the horse seemed to be in shock, it showed no clear signs of pain. But the sight was so disturbing that the soldier instinctively ran off. Even so, when he looked back, he saw that the animal was slowly following him, as if seeking help, with a desperate and human-like look in its expression. Among the survivors, one boy stood out for his silent struggle. Burned in the throat and mouth, he had lost his voice, unable to utter a single sound. However, he continued to communicate through desperate gestures and intense eyes, begging for help and water from those who passed by. His fragile body, marked by radiation, conveyed a powerful message about the invisible pain of those victims. Pellegrino uses this account to show that even in forced silence, human suffering is present and cries out for attention. After the explosion, a woman was found wandering aimlessly through the destroyed streets of Hiroshima. Her eyes had been completely destroyed by the bomb's intense heat wave. Her sockets were empty, open, and bleeding. She tried to guide herself by the sound of distant voices touching the walls for support, but total blindness and the horror around her left her lost and terrified. Eto was only a boy when hell fell from the sky. He was at school at that moment, like on any other day. 5 minutes after the explosion, he managed to escape alive, emerging from the rubble of the partially destroyed building. As he came out, he found himself in a thick, suffocating, dark fog. The smoke carried a heavy chemical smell. Around him, the other students were almost all burned, their faces, arms, and legs covered in open wounds and blisters. Together with about 40 panicked classmates, Hiroshi ran toward the school pool, seeking some kind of relief or protection. They screamed for help, but no one answered. When he arrived, the boy realized something disturbing. There were girls fainted by the edge of the water, some already lifeless. They wore only white shirts. The rest of their clothes had been consumed by the extreme heat, along with part of their skin. Later, as he left the pool, Hiroshi found an apocalyptic scene. Children walked slowly through the destroyed streets. They were covered in soot, with swollen eyes and burst lips. They wandered aimlessly, soundless, as if they were living shadows of themselves. He looked across the river and saw a crowd trying to escape the flames. People ran in desperation, stumbling, falling into the water as if swarms were being pushed by an invisible force. Houses on the riverbank collapsed, dragging down those who tried to save themselves. Soon, burning bodies and debris floated together in a scene that defied all logic. Suddenly, around him, the ground began to ignite in spontaneous flames. The heat was unbearable. Hiroshi, overcome with fear, began running without direction, guided only by the instinct to survive. Amid the rubble of a collapsed building, a man was seen digging with his bare hands to bury his young daughter, who had died in the explosion. The child was covered in burns and marks from the shockwave. her body lifeless but still warm. Without tools, without support, the father did what he could to give rest to what remained of the one he loved. Pellegrino describes this simple gesture as an act of resistance and profound love, a desperate attempt to preserve dignity in the midst of chaos and death. A boy was found wandering through the streets with the skin of his arm completely peeled away and hanging in thin strips like bands of cloth. The horrific burns had consumed layers of skin, leaving raw, bleeding flesh exposed. Despite the sharp pain and shock, he kept walking, probably looking for his parents or a safe place. A young, severely injured soldier tried to improvise a bandage for his left hand, almost completely destroyed by the explosion. The limb was unrecognizable, with fingers burned and nearly disintegrated. Despite the extreme pain, the soldier maintained a surprising calm, clinging to the hope of survival. Help us keep this project alive here on YouTube by subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching, God bless you all, and see you soon.